Hello and you're very welcome to Adapt Radio. I'm Dr Claire O'Connell, and in this episode we're focusing on Adapt's Advance 2025, the flagship forum dedicated to trusted AI innovation.
From the Adapt Centre at Trinity College, this is Adapt Radio, presenting groundbreaking innovations one conversation at a time.
If we continue to believe that bigger is better, we are continuing to give credibility to a model that is ultimately enabling a type of global reach and global dominance by a handful of companies. I think there's another piece of this that gets into the realm of measurement and epistemology, where we need to really step back and be like, oh, wait, how is better being assessed? Who gets to measure that?
This annual event, which took place in Dublin, brought together people from universities, businesses and government, and the core question for everyone this year was, how can we use trusted teamwork to help organisations successfully use and scale up AI and other new digital technology? The discussions covered strategic topics such as open source AI, cybersecurity and using AI for democracy, and we're going to share the biggest takeaways from the day and highlight some examples where trusted AI is already creating impact. So let's get into it.
I'm particularly looking forward to the interview between Dr Abeba Birhane. I think Abeba is in the room. She is the founder and director of the AI Accountability Lab, which is hosted in Trinity. And Abeba is in discussion with Meredith Whittaker, who is another awesome leader in voice in this space. And she is the president of the Signal Foundation.
As you all know, Meredith is one of the towering figures in the field of AI. Her decade of work has one of the most profound impacts in shaping what has now become ethical AI, responsible AI, transparency, and so on. It has also brought about profound impacts from academia to industry. During her time at Google, Meredith was one of the core organizers for the Google walkouts, where over 20,000 Google employees walked out in protest of the military use of AI, in protest of surveillance, and also opposing sexual misconduct. That event was significant not only in the AI space, but in the tech world in general. It forced Google to discontinue their military contract with what was known as Project Maven, and it also forced them to oust one of the VPs that was implicated in sexual misconduct. Meredith Whittaker is also the co-founder of the AI Now Institute, a research institute that has been one of the most exemplars in discerning through AI hype, dissecting and differentiating AI hype from reality, and constantly reminding us to stay grounded on questions that really matter. Questions such as the growing influence of the concentration of power in the hands of few in the AI industry, questions around labor, what goes underneath the AI pipeline, and the need to protect fundamental rights such as the freedom of movement, freedom of privacy, and as we've seen in this panel, the need to also protect the rule of law, which is sorely needed. As well as her organizing work, co-founding the AI Now Institute, providing various congressional testimonies to the US Congress, and holding a position as the president of Signal, and I could keep going. The Signal Foundation, which is responsible for Signal, one of the most trusted privacy-friendly messaging apps. Meredith's research and writing has also been hugely influential and impactful. Meredith's academic contribution encompasses from uncovering and warning about corporate capture, covering sustainability, debunking myths such as bigger is better, but also the foundation for open sourcing research or open source research. Some of it we will delve into during this fireside chat. So as I said, we will be here the whole time if I attempt to list all of Meredith's standing in the field or her accolades or her contribution as one of the giants in the field. So I'll just point out that Meredith is one of the most trusted and respected voices in our field. And she's a fierce proponent of privacy, transparency, and the rule of law. And with that, I would like you to welcome Meredith to the fireside chat.
Thank you, Abeba. Is this where I talk and say that you're one of my heroes?
Yes, welcome. And unfortunately, due to personal reasons, she's not able to join us in person. So this is how we will hold it. So the panel is structured around agentic AI. So perhaps we will start kind of by delineating what agentic AI is, might be deciphering it from like LLMs and AI companions. And then I would love your input into various reasons that we should be careful about implementing or throwing around agentic AI everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I feel like there's an entire discussion around these naming conventions and the marketing and the branding that we could just sort of get into and stay with. Because in some sense, agentic AI is like a rebrand and a refresh of the future promises that are constantly morphing, constantly almost here, as a way of, at the most basic and practical level, kind of propping up the markets that are making these promises. So I don't know, a year ago it was LLMs.
Yes.
We were sort of using that term, and then agents came on the scene. It's the year of agents, but agents is in some ways an empty signifier. A lot of things that were called assistants are now being rebranded agents, and so we hit this kind of fuzziness, which is part of the legacy of the term artificial intelligence itself, in that like it's a container that is it's kind of an umbrella that has, under which a lot of different technologies have been described for over 80 years, right? And so it's in some sense difficult to pin down. Right. In this moment, agents are describing very broadly systems that work to complete tasks on your or an organization or whatever behalf autonomously. Right. And so there's sort of two things that agents kind of have in common across the many different products and promises and fever dreams that are being described with this term. It's that they don't stop and ask for permission. You tell it to do something. I want you to book a rental car for me, and then calculate the driving time from the rental car store to the hotel, and then tell my friends who are staying at the hotel when I'll be there. Like, made that example up right now, right? But kind of a basic task. And I guess you don't want to do it because you got a busy life and you just want to live that life. So agent, do it.
Right.
And that sounds kind of convenient. But in this case, an agent, would then go off to do that on its own without your intervention, without saying, hey, do I have permission to do this? Hey, is this okay with you? It just sort of, autonomously working. And it works through a number of different steps. So it's kind of, like trying to use the data it has access to make decisions that ultimately achieve that objective function, that objective of booking the car, getting the route, getting the drive time, and telling your friends. There's a lot of issues with that. We don't have agents that are actually able to do that. There's compounding failure rates. There's sort of, context windows that become extremely expensive if they have to remember, all of the, kind of dialogue and steps, the sort of, data that is being sort of used for this, all of that. But from Signal's perspective, and why we in particular, and I in particular, are sort of pointing this out as a real threat and a real problem, is there are fundamental privacy issues with this paradigm. Because in order to do that car booking scenario, right, well, it needs access to an image of your driver's license, we assume, to show the car rental place. It needs to be able to just share that with an external account. It needs access to your credit card, money on your behalf. It needs the ability to your driver's license number, whatever else is on that form, your address. It needs a lot of personal data, very sensitive data. It needs access to your calendar to schedule that. So that's part of it. It needs access to, and this is where it becomes very personal for us. Let's say your signal and your signal messages, your contact lists, in order to message your friends, in order to tell them this is what's happening. And that there at a systems level is ultimately a kind of backdoor. And the way these things are being architected, particularly the integration of these systems into the operating system, is fundamentally shifting how we see these, the role of the operating system, the role of the device, and is an existential threat for apps like Signal, who look to maintain robust privacy at the application layer. Privacy requires us to be able to trust the operating system and requires that we don't have, bots and agents and whatever we're calling them, kind of demanding access to Signal in a way that undermines our project. That's the padded version of my anxiety about agents.
Yeah, exactly. So on the one hand, you have agents being advertised as capable of, any tasks, some of the tasks that you have described. But in reality, to what extent are they functional? To what extent do they get the actual tasks done? This is one of the areas, I think, where there is a lot of misinformation. Just because agents are advertised, we often are under the impression that they work flawlessly. So if you can just elaborate on these functional failures, you have perfectly laid out the privacy implications.
Well, look, agent it's not AI, it's a magical other thing outside of tech. It's a system. It requires, software and hardware. It's probably most of these systems that we see sort of marketed or advertised are using a handful of different models. These models are, in most cases, when we're talking about the sort of premier use cases, and being run on cloud servers of your device, because there's no, LLMs and these sort of big models are too large to run on device. They take up too much compute. And so this is, as an aside, why Apple, who's like famously stringent about privacy, had to develop private cloud compute, because they simply can't run these systems on the device, even though that's the direction they've been moving for AI. So what are the concerns with accuracy here? Well, I think one that I'll just raise that's very fundamental, it's math 101, is compounding failure rates. So say you had a model that was 95% accurate, which Abeba, you and I know there's no such model, right? 95 is way, way, way higher than a model, even if they're being measured for accuracy against sclerotic benchmarks that aren't real. It's still that we don't have anything that accurate, but we'll take that as an example. There's a model that's 95% accurate, and then it needs to go through 30 steps, like looking at my calendar, looking for my driver's license, taking that, filling out the form at the rental car place, et cetera, to get to that car example I just gave, right? 30 different turns, as we'd say. Well, a 95% accurate model without a compounding failure rate, sort of to the power of 30, you didn't get to like a 20%, 30% accuracy rate. You could do the math on your phone, but if it's AI, they'll probably get it wrong. So, there's a real issue with just how are these promises ever going to be kept with the state of these models. And then there's an issue with the way these things are being architected, just generally, like, the context window, which is a fancy name for like a place you put all of this sensitive data, and it sort of like sloshes around, and some of it they sort of like kept in state so that the agent can refer to it to kind of have context for like, what's the relationship of the next task or the next kind of step in this, the next turn to the last one. That's really expensive and it's really insecure. Right? There's a huge cost in terms of compute to remembering that, to processing that at every turn. So just when I'm naming the most basic, like fundamental, like, this is math and the cost of running these things. It doesn't really add up. And there are a lot of other issues we can get to just in the difficulty of securing these architectures and the type of permissions that they're being given in the, but I will stop there because
So basically, agents are a privacy and security nightmare. And speaking of, chasing AI craze, and as researchers, we tend to unwillingly, hop onto the next craze because, we have to do evaluations and so on. Yeah, as you said, before we have gotten large language models right, because they are inherently unreliable, we have built AI agents on top of it. And now we are on to the next craze, which is AI companions, which are garnering massive uptake, especially in particularly with minors and young users. And the mental health issue is one of the most really devastating implications of this area. I would love it if you could comment on that.
Yeah. I mean, in some sense, this is sort of, it's outside of my field. I'm not a psychologist. It just breaks my heart. We knew this. Eliza, which I know you've done such brilliant work on many of these topics. But for anyone in the audience who is sort of across this very particular domain and the, I think psychological implications of creating a human-like mimicry through a chatbot is basically what we're talking about. The anthropomorphization, good job, of these, systems that are not human, that are controlled by outside entities that can be changed by companies or corporations or your employer at any point. But there are noted issues with that we have understood since the 1970s, or at least since the 1970s, when Joseph Weizenbaum, who was an early, we would call him an AI pioneer if we weren't sensitive to colonial language. He was a Holocaust survivor. He was an MIT researcher and professor, and he created this very basic chatbot. We would laugh at it today, right? It looks like a command line. It's a rule-based system, so not these deep learning style systems, but ultimately, for a person interacting with it, it's kind of simulating a sentient interlocutor, someone else at the other end of the line who's listening to you and talking to you. And it was built to simulate a therapeutic relationship. So you're the patient, it's the therapist, and you say I'm feeling bad today, I'm feeling good today, this and this and that, my mom, my dad, my past. And it says, thank you, tell me more. And it kind of just keeps prompting you to speak. But nothing sophisticated at all is really what I'm stressing here. And he opens his book, Computer Power and Human Reason and Computing Power. If I got that wrong, please correct me. But that's the gist. And he opens his book with talking about how worried he became when he realized that even this very rudimentary system was leading to people developing kind of, I would say, maybe relationships with the bot, treating it as if it were human. One of the people who worked with him said, asking him to close the door because she was talking with Eliza, and it felt that she was, that Weizenbaum was intruding on that relationship. And he, discusses how dangerous it is to anthropomorphize these systems and how dangerous it is specifically because who controls these systems, what objectives they are pursuing, how they can be used to manipulate, all of that is sort of hidden. We're treating it as if it's our friend, but it's actually a multinational corporation who is deploying these at the behest of our corporate employer, for example, in order to monitor and surveil us and collect information that could be used to, say, fire us. So that's sort of a through line. None of this was secret. And the machine learning researcher, Ben Recht, who's at Berkeley, had a really good post on his Substack recently, just sort of talking about how, I don't know, unconscionable is my word, but I think it comes through his text. It is for the AI safety community not to have flagged this for the sort of devastating psychological manipulation that can be perpetuated by these bots, not to have been accounted for in the thinking about what, safe means. And that's in addition to the facts that, we know that we as humans have a tendency to want to be heard, to want to be understood, to want to be loved, that we, see faces in clouds, that we, sort of do a lot of work sort of patching in the missing parts to, find the meaning of what our interlocutor is, to relate to, the person or the bot in this case who is speaking to us, and just how dangerous it is to weaponize the ability to manipulate that. And then just how sad it is. Right. It makes me very sad to think about.
Yeah. And on top of that, you have, these systems are built with a business model that maximizes for engagement. And as a result, you have, sycophancy and AI psychosis, which is a term that's recently been introduced into the vocabulary and so on. And you have, CEO of OpenAI, like Sam Altman, recently declaring that, one of the areas they will venture into is introducing erotica to verified users, which is a really, dangerous area to navigate to. But I will kind of change the topic and discuss the idea of bigger is better. I know you have done work on that. The bigger the better, larger data sets, massive GPU farms and like trillions of parameters has been the norm, even though there has been a lot of empirical work debunking that intuition. But we still kind of persisting ahead with, the bigger the better. And I guess my question to you is, at what cost does that come?
So many costs. And I almost want to turn the mic back to you, Abeba, because you've done a lot of work on this. And I think it deserves to be represented here. Yeah, I think there are costs around the centralization of power, and that's a real one. There are only a handful of companies due to their dominating a monopolistic business model that, and I won't get into the history there, but there's long history. But the fact is there are only a handful of companies that can create and release large scale, bigger is better AI at scale from start to finish. And those are, we call them the hyperscalers, but they're essentially companies that you're able to scale, build out their infrastructure. We can refer to the primitive accumulation stage of tech in the 90s, 2000s, into the early 2010s to build these kind of monopolistic networks and platforms that gave them, the data, huge amounts of data. So you can imagine YouTube or Instagram can just sort of continually refresh big data stores, gave them the infrastructure that was globally distributed. So particularly the cloud companies, and gave them the access to market, which I think is a piece that isn't often theorized here, but is also important. Okay, you can buy a hyperscaler, you can buy a bunch of GPUs, you can spend your billions that way. You can scrape the web and use one of these, gross, like Leon data sets, which, Abeba, you should talk after this just a little bit about your work on how grotesque some of the data that is contained in these web scraping sets are. And you can do that, and then you can build a model with it, right? Spend billions on a training run, huge amounts of electricity on compute. But ultimately, if you want to monetize that model, you're going to have to go through either licensing it through an API via a cloud company. So, similar how Mistral in France licenses their models through Azure, and I think, some of the other companies, or you integrate it into a platform. So if you're Meta, you integrate, the model into Facebook, and, for years, AI has been sort of optimizing these engagement-driven feeds. That was, why deep learning became popular again, as Google then Meta realized, deep learning is really good at optima seeking when it has infrastructure, when it has data. And if you want to track the history of how YouTube became kind of grotesque, that we're kind of recommending weird steps that kind of went down a anger and rage rabbit hole. You can look at the implementation of deep learning to sort of inform that algorithm in YouTube. That's a bit of an aside, but nonetheless, there's a handful of companies that can sort of access that market, that can let model builders access that market, and they exist primarily in the US and China. So the bigger is better paradigm is implicitly and in some cases explicitly privileging them and resources they have. So as a narrative, we have to understand that narrative and that article of faith as part of their moat. If we continue to believe that bigger is better, we are continuing to give credibility to a model that is ultimately enabling a type of sort of global reach and global dominance by a handful of companies. I think there's another piece of this that gets into the realm of measurement and epistemology, where we need to really step back and be like, oh, wait, how is better being assessed?
Yes.
Who gets to measure that? And this is, my way back backgrounds is I built large scale measurement systems for network performance. And so like a hypersensitivity to data, and then to how important it is to own the evaluation criteria if you want to win the game, let's say. And I think what you see, and again, Abeba, I would love for you to talk about some of your work here, because you've contributed to my understanding and contributed greatly to the field. But you have benchmarks that are used to measure different models' performance against each other. So, the new version of GPT, 4 is better than, Claude and all these others. And that's how we're, saying we're better. And then there's headlines across Business Insider and everything else that's state of the art, new model.
Yeah.
But when we look at how they're measured, it's really narrow. It is very rarely representative of real life contexts within which these systems will be used. And oftentimes when you do apply them in real life contexts, they fail down pretty significantly. And they're much less effective than, in many cases, smaller models that are purpose built for a given context or situation with data that is appropriate for that situation. And so there is there's a kind of deeper layer in which we need to actually destabilize how better is being defined in order to recognize, what do we actually want? Better at what? Better for whom? Does it actually work when it's deployed in a hospital and a tired nurse has to use it for something? Or is it breaking because the size of the cart that they have to push this machine on isn't right? Whatever it is, but if you don't actually have that in scope, you're making a lot of claims that are very convenient for these bigger, better hyperscaler AI giants, but aren't actually reflective of what these things really do. So,
yeah.
And then the climate cost.
The climate cost is massive. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you. Maybe you can say a few things on that as well before I move on to the next point.
I mean, this isn't my field exactly, but I've learned from folks like Eliza and others who are looking very closely at these systems, and they just, it's now no secret, it's now mainstream, but you have towns without water in the US. You have, the amount of CO2 that's being released into the atmosphere is increasing rapidly. Coal-fired power plants are staying online. Fossil fuel generated power is staying online, because even though renewable energy is being made available, it's being used to power these AI data centers, not to help us decommission dirty energy. So there's I can pass it back to you. I'm sure you have things to say there, but it's, let's be real. We need water to live. We need to maintain reasonable climate boundaries, or we don't survive. And there is a tension between a livable future and the energy and water consumption of these infrastructures.
Definitely. And bigger is better is certainly more of an intuition of the field rather than where you can find substantial evidence. I mean, some of the work we actually did was looking at, as data sets get larger, does, problematic content within those data sets, does it kind of dissipate and represent something like the ground truths? Or does problematic content decline, or does it increase? And unsurprisingly, the larger the data set, the bigger your problem, the higher the hateful content, the higher the pornography, and the larger any associated problems that arise with it. Another area where there is some misconception and misunderstanding within the field is around open sourcing, at least on two fronts. On the one hand, open sourcing has just become, a term that companies like Meta slap on without actually being explicit or clear about what actually is being open sourced. So you have this ambiguity around what do you have to actually open up for a given system to be open sourced. You also have this notion that open sourcing is equals unprecedented innovation, and it might be the solution to the various problems we are seeing. So maybe you can address the misunderstandings and problems around open sourcing within these two domains.
Yeah, this is, I was fortunate because my research group at Google was under it was in the open source, kind of under the open source group, so to speak. And so I was exposed for many, many years to just how specific and pedantic my beloved open source community is, miles of mailing lists, messages talking about the nuances of the different licenses and it's a very precise, very legalistic, community, and it has a very specific history. And so, that refers to sort of a kind of a software and the ability to sort of, openly scrutinize software, to sort of develop it, to, take out, some software code and reuse it somewhere else. That came out of the 90s, and there was the free software community that wanted everything to be, that was frankly just more anti-capitalist, and then the open source community that was like, well, we're building large networks, they need to interoperate. Ultimately, we all have to kind of have the same standards, and open source is a way to do that, but we want to sort of cleave it from this sort of anti-capitalist strain. Not to get too much into that history, Via Coleman and others have done really good work there. Suffice to say, I was really sensitive to this, and I saw references to open source AI, and I was like, what does that mean, right? And because I know what it means when it's talking about software. So what does it mean? And it turns out it didn't really mean anything. Anything from sort of an open API that would let you use a model or a system, to model that had the weights available, where documentation on data provenance, where all sorts of other things were sort of made available to the public for scrutiny. All of those things just got sort of munged into this that became kind of a marketing label. One of the reasons, along with my co-authors, David Witter and Sarah Myers-West, we, decided to dig into this was because what we saw was, what I will call, definitional arbitrage, where the common sense understanding of what open source meant for software, which is, reusable, more democratic, possible for, to sort of distribute the wealth to everyone and let us all kind of build on it and use it. That's the intuitive understanding, because we understand open source from that paradigm, was being implied to refer to these AI systems, even though it didn't, and used to, implicitly or explicitly visit back claims that open source AI would would solve the issue of concentrated power, would solve the issue that only a handful of companies are able to develop these systems, the issue that, academia was not able to drive the research field because they needed this access, that was sort of leading to a sort of thinning of research in academia, that was just all those issues, I think, probably fairly common to the folks in this audience. When in fact, open source AI does enable this, if we're talking about more actually open, open weights, open documentation, we can scrutinize it. So we can tell some things about the model, but not a huge amount, given its sort of non-deterministic nature. But it doesn't open source access to compute, which is still very, very expensive.
Or data.
That's what I mean. it doesn't open source access to data. So you can use sort of you can pull down openly available, openly licensed data sets, but they work to actually clean that data, to basically discipline it into shape so that it can result in a model whose training can produce, like outputs that are useful in one or another way, or at least marketable. That's a huge amount of labor. And there is the labor required to, reinforcement learning with human feedback, which is like a fancy little term that sounds technical that I think was just made up to make it seem like a lot of workers generally in the majority world paid very little for sort of like the emotional buffer zones to make sure these AIs don't spit out replicants like the horrible, insulting, offensive, like nasty, dangerous stuff that it's trained on in these sort of internet-wide data sets. You kind of have to do some work to do that. Like these workers do that work. And the epistemic dungeon, as I've called it, suffice it to say, none of that is open source, nor is the compute unit needed for inference to use these models, which is still much, much more expensive than like a normal software code. So yet we were seeing, again, this sort of narrative arbitrage was the sort of, that I would say like clever marketing, where a number of these companies hoped that people would just assume when we used open source, it is referring to kind of like the qualities that open source would guarantee for software, and thus take their word on it that open source AI would be a more democratic, less concentrated version of AI, when in fact that is, my friends, not the case.
Yeah. It's so unfortunate that open source is one of the co-opted terms within AI, similar to democratizing and so on. But I also think Europe is moving towards, finding substitutes for big tech, infrastructures. So open sourcing might be, is one of the hopes for kind of pushing back against corporate monopoly. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Yeah, one there and there.
So thank you. There were a lot of really interesting points made during this discussion. You touched a bit at the very end on maybe the concept of sovereign AI, which is possibly more aligned with the user's objectives or intentions than the misalignment that the AI that's currently owned by large global corporations is. So I wondered if you could just give thoughts on if that's a good thing to pursue, effectively nationalized AI services or AI as a public good.
Did you catch that? Should I repeat a bit?
I did. I heard that, and I'm like digesting it. Because look, I think, statistical models, which AI described in one form or another, that help us see patterns across meaningful data that we trust as a proxy for our world, can be really useful in a complex system, in a complex world, in a, one or another social function, right? But I think we need to push on what sovereign means here, because frankly, I hear it describes everything and nothing at this point. There's a sort of, signifier for a type of anxiety about the dependence on platforms, on tech, on multinationals that has been around for a very long time, but has intensified in this moment. And there's now this sort of geopolitical shift where people are talking about it a lot more. So I think to really answer that question, I think you need to start with what is the use case or use cases that AI is important for in your given context, in your country or your town or your Europe or your South America. I don't know. That data do you have that you trust as a proxy for the euro? Because that's an issue we didn't really get into, but a lot of this data doesn't, the distribution doesn't reflect the context in which it's being deployed. And frankly, there's a pattern here of treating online data that was created to answer the questions interesting to advertisers as, sort of the ground truth for intelligence, right? And it's often very mismatched. So do you have the data? What type of questions do you want to ask of the data? And what sort of, how would this AI be used on that infrastructure? Because again, that access to market piece is still present, right? You can buy it, you can use, you can train it, but like in the material world of hardware and software and systems and an ecosystem full of dependencies, what does it actually do? Where does it run? Who owns that process? And then if you're telling me about sort of a democratic society, what is the democratic governance of that system, particularly given that, reality is messy and dynamic. Data from 5 years ago is not going to reflect the state of a community now. And that's going to need to be, discussed and, kind of an agonistic process of like, how do we update that? Who has authority to say the AI is wrong? How do we make sure those adjudications happen? So there's, outside of like, do we spend a bunch of money on the current version of NVIDIA chips and redirect our energy supply there? There are, I think, bigger questions about like, what is AI tasked with doing? Who has control over it? What is the ground truth on which it's trained? And it, the data, that its inference is sort of running against. And then, how do democratic processes fit into that vision? So I hope that helps answer that question.
Yeah. We will wrap up here. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for more questions. And thank you so much for joining us, Meredith, even though it's virtual. Next time, we hope to get you here in person. But join me in thanking Meredith.
Thank you, Abeba. I'm just such a huge fan of your work, and I really wish I were there in person because I actually want to now do this interview, but me asking the questions and you're answering them because you have so much insight and you're a hero of mine. Thank you so much for having me. And I want to thank all the staff and the workers. I know it is a pain to do remote things like this. It causes a lot of anxiety because we promise things of AI, but doing a team stream is very difficult. It breaks often, and you all were so lovely, so easy to work with. And I appreciate the extra effort to enable me to join remotely. So thank you all.
Thank you, Olivia and team.
And that brings us to the end of our discussion on the insights from Adapt's Advanced 2025. The key message was clear. The future of AI needs to be both powerful and responsible. And the event proved that if we want to scale up AI successfully, we need strong teamwork between everyone, from researchers to policymakers. Thanks for tuning in to hear about the outcomes of this important forum, and I hope it gives you a clear picture of where the movement for trusted AI is headed. Until next time, from me, Dr. Claire O'Connell, Slán, and thanks for listening.
The Adapt Radio podcast is brought to you by the Adapt Centre at Trinity College Dublin. Find out more about their extensive research work at adaptcentre.ie. Join us next time to hear about more groundbreaking innovations. To get new episodes automatically, just click the follow button on your player right now. The Adapt Radio podcast is produced by dustpod.io with episodes monthly on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts.